Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Realm Between, God of Land, by Phoenix Gray, narrated by Neil Hellegers. Chapter 1. The Realm, Day 255. The tavern was bustling with people. If not for the fact that Udin had beaten Azure there, he might not have found a seat at all. Udin was sandwiched between a man in a full set of armor and a man wearing a red robe, all of them raising their horns cheerily, conversing as if they hadn't a care in the world. Azure didn't understand how the half-imp could look so happy. Finding out the lesser Minotaur core's low value had drained him of the enthusiasm he would have normally had from being able to shop. Prior to arriving at the tavern, Azure had stopped at the first merchant he could locate that sold potions of minor stamina. At 4 gold apiece, buying just 10 of them had cost almost half of his savings. You have received the following item: Potion of Minor Stamina. Quantity 10, item class common, quality poor, weight 0.0 kilograms, uses, restores 25 stamina. Now all Azure wanted was to find a nice quiet corner of the tavern to sit in and drink his discontent away. Quiet was not going to happen tonight, though. The half-imp turned his head to the side to ask the armor-clad man to move over a few feet to make room for Azure. "Did you do any shopping at all?" Azure eyed Udin as he squeezed in next to him. "Nope. What's the point when we're probably going to die anyway?" The half-imp replied nonchalantly before waving down the barmaid to make right on his promise of buying Azure an ale. Azure thought he must be serious, because Udin wasn't typically generous with his money. Half the time when he offered something, he'd pretend to forget when the time came for him to pay up. "Do you really believe that?" Azure raised an eyebrow at him. 10 more levels, 10 chances to die. We'd better hope there are enough monsters for us to all level up by the end." The barmaid returned and placed a horn of ale in front of Azure, her ample bosom practically brushing his cheek as she leaned over him. A coy smile played across her lips, and she made it a point to touch his shoulder before walking away. Azure had her before he'd entered the never-ending dungeon. For as short a time as it had been since then, it seemed like a lifetime ago. Just thinking about going back into the dungeon made him uncomfortable, but it was all he could think about. The half-imp's pessimism certainly wasn't helping to put his mind at ease. You have received the following item: Pint of beer. Item class common, quality average, weight 1.0 kilograms. Uses: makes your worries feel less harrowing. Effects: increases strength by 3% for 1 hour, decreases attack of all weapons and magic by 20% for 1 hour, decreases agility, dexterity, charisma, and luck by 3 points for 1 hour. "You gonna have a piece of that again?" Udin nodded in the barmaid's direction as she sauntered away. Azure kept his gaze forward, lost in thought. If the pattern continued, by the time they reached the next boss level in the never-ending dungeon, they'd be facing a level 20 monster. All 3 of them were far from level 20. Udin was right. It didn't seem possible for them to survive. There's got to be another way. He ignored the half-imp's question. Sex was the farthest thing from his mind. "There is, but that stupid archer is too stubborn to listen." Udin sank down over his horn of ale. Azure turned to him. "I'm willing to listen." The half-imp lowered his voice. "I still think we should go kidnap Princess Zadori to get to the king. I've heard she goes into Underland once a week to do charity work. It probably wouldn't be that difficult." Azure exhaled a breath of disappointment and shook his head. "That's suicide. And returning to the dungeon isn't?" Udin cast an annoyed glance in his direction. "Someone else has to know about the keeper." "Well, it's Jin's idea or mine, and neither of you is on board with my idea, so back to the dungeon we go." Udin lifted his horn to his lips. The sky had grown dark, and the bottom of Azure's cup was long dry before the archer joined them. Though Azure wanted to get wasted, he didn't want to have to deal with the nearly debilitating hangover that would come with it. Luckily, the tavern had mostly cleared. 10 more horns of ale sat empty in front of the half-imp, and over the course of Azure spending the afternoon ignoring the advances that the barmaid kept making at him, she had somehow ended up on Udin's lap. Azure hadn't paid attention to how it had happened, nor did he care. "It took you a while," he grumbled at Jin. "I was busy," the archer replied before ordering some food. "Seems like you've been busy too." He cast a glance at Udin, who had barely noticed him, and was whispering something undoubtedly inappropriate into the barmaid's ears that made her cheeks flame, before returning his attention to Azure. "Did you get all of your shopping done?" "I picked up 10 potions of minor stamina," Azure replied. "And you?" The archer turned toward the half-imp. "I saved my money for ale, you droll sod." Udin frowned at Jin before slapping the barmaid on the ass to send her away. The archer inhaled deeply, perhaps to stop himself from saying something he might regret. Instead, he replied, "Of course you did." Once Jin had finished eating, he and Azure retired back to the inn, though Udin elected to stay behind. They paid the ancient Aegis Inn's exorbitant fee of 1 gold and 2 silver apiece for their own rooms for the night. The archer clapped his hand on Azure's shoulder before they parted ways, drawing his attention. "It's going to be all right, Azure." "You keep saying that." He shrugged Jin's hand off. "Have you ever lost anyone you care about?" The archer was still for a moment before he replied. "I have lost more than you could possibly fathom." Then he walked away. If Azure had cared more, he might have spent the night pondering Jin's words, but he was solely focused on what lay ahead. 10 more floors of the never-ending dungeon, and the large possibility that they might not make it out alive. Chapter 2. The Realm, Day 256. The morning came, far too early, as it always did when the archer insisted that they wake at the crack of dawn. Azure had been thoroughly enjoying having a nice soft bed all to himself. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept on one without the half-imp cramped by his side. "Have you seen Udin?" were the first words out of Jin's mouth when Azure opened the door. "No." For half a second, Azure wondered if the archer was actually concerned about the half-imp. That was until Jin said they should leave him behind. The sleepy haze seemed to clear slowly from Azure's brain as he gathered his belongings. Stepping out into the hall, he found the archer waiting for him, his back pressed against the wall, one leg crossed over the other and his arms folded over his chest. As soon as Azure had emerged from the room, Jin reanimated. "Let's go," the archer motioned before taking off down the hall. "We're not leaving Udin." Azure followed behind. "We'll check the tavern. If he's not there, then he's not coming with us." Jin reached the stairs, then began descending them at a hurried pace. "I'm not going into the never-ending dungeon as a 2-man team." Azure furrowed his brow. The archer ignored him and continued to the tavern, which was relatively empty with it being so early in the morning. "Let's have breakfast before we leave," Azure suggested, trying to buy more time for the half-imp to show up. "I'd like to enter the dungeon today, if possible. We already wasted time by coming back here." Discontent was plain in Jin's voice. "We won't have a chance to eat anything besides bland meat for a while. We can afford the time to fill our bellies." Azure found his way to one of the benches and plopped down to order breakfast. The barmaid that had occupied the half-imp's lap the night before was absent. In her place, the tavern owner walked around fulfilling all his duties plus hers. He did not appear to be happy. "It looks like they're off asleep somewhere," Azure noted. The same girl always worked this particular tavern, so his theory made sense. Jin had no comment. He scarfed down the eggs and starchy biscuit placed in front of him with haste. Azure wondered if he'd even bothered to chew. Refusing to be rushed, Azure took his time, or tried to. It wasn't long before the archer grew impatient. "You're done, let's go." He grabbed the edge of Azure's plate and pulled it away from him. There was still about a quarter of an egg and half a biscuit left. Azure was most certainly not done. He reached for his plate to reclaim it, but the archer pulled it further away before standing. "Are we really in that much of a hurry?" Azure scowled up at him. "Yes," Jin replied pointedly. "Do you really want to risk your life on the whims of someone undependable? He knew we would be leaving this early." "I could ask the same of you." Azure finally stood. "If you'll remember, I wasn't much use against most of the humanoid creatures in the never-ending dungeon. It's not safe for us to go in without him. It is a problem that would be remedied if your hand was forced. You would not allow me to perish if you could save me, because that would mean you would die too. Udin is a crutch for you. You let him do the dirty work in your stead because you know he can. If you want to get stronger, you have to shed your apprehension about killing humans and similar races. You won't be able to do that until you change your way of thinking." "I can kill if I feel threatened," Azure countered, "but I prefer reason over slaughter. If violence can at all be avoided, it should be. I will never understand why you see things the other way around, and I refuse to kill creatures that are no threat to me." "Game is no threat to you, yet you kill that." Jin wiped the lard from the breakfast off his fingers with a cloth before setting it on the table. "Game is food. There's a purpose behind killing it. It doesn't go to waste." Azure cocked his head to the side, waiting for the archer to make a counterpoint that they had been slaughtering animals without reason all the way from the welcoming summit to Nozion. He was not sure he'd have an argument against that. Monsters are experience. There's a purpose behind killing them. If it's in a dungeon, it's a monster, whether creature or man. It doesn't go to waste. Jin turned away to walk out of the tavern. Azure sucked in a breath. The archer was infuriating at times. It was as if no life mattered but his own and the people he aligned himself with. Briefly, Azure wondered how Jin had gotten so cold. There was definitely a story behind it. There always was. But there was no point in asking. The archer shared nothing about himself if he could avoid it. Their argument had consumed about as much time as it would have taken for Azure to finish his breakfast. Taking one last longing look at the remnants of his uneaten food, he sighed and followed Jin out the door. They left Nozion and walked toward the never-ending dungeon, mostly in silence. Azure occasionally grumbled about it not being smart for them to go in without more party members, but the archer ignored him, clearly done with the conversation. He took long strides, conveying a sense of urgency. It felt more to Azure like he was making sure they left Udin behind. Then again, Jin had been grouchy to even have left the never-ending dungeon in the first place. Maybe he really did just want to get back, worried that they wouldn't be able to accomplish everything they needed to in time to save Azure's life. 2 months had already passed since the archer had made a deal with Thinbor to bring Azure back from the dead in exchange for half of his levels. Tiny Owl flew over and alighted on Jin's shoulders for but a few minutes of their walk before taking back off into the trees. It was a bit startling seeing him. He made appearances so infrequently that Azure often forgot he was the archer's pet. Despite their quickened pace, they reached the clearing surrounding the entrance to the never-ending dungeon as the sun was setting. It was the same scene as before, with adventurers camped around the magically suspended door, preparing for their journey into the dungeon. This time, instead of the door being plain brown, it appeared to be painted white. Azure had briefly noticed the change when they left the dungeon 2 days prior. At the time, he'd been more focused on getting away from the dungeon than fascinated by the magic that had taken place when they had cleared the first 10 floors. The color change had marked the dungeon saving their place. It was a color that only they could see. "Are you ready?" Jin asked as they approached the door. "No, I'm not." Azure planted his heels into the ground. They'd been walking all day. He was absolutely exhausted and not in the mood to have to deal with monsters. The archer was almost to the door when it opened, and 2 adventurers came tumbling through. A woman clad in green robes had her arms wrapped around a man in armor. One of his leg plates was missing, and so was about half of his calf, the wound going all the way down to the bone. Tears poured down both of their faces, and the man kept muttering, "I couldn't save them," repeatedly, while the woman tried desperately to console him and keep him standing upright. Jin made way for them, and several other adventurers stood to come offer them aid. It was apparent that the 2 had run out of healing potions while they were in the dungeon. Activating Analyze showed Azure that they were both a much higher level than him. The look on their faces was enough to tell him that more than one of their party members had died in that boss fight. It also filled him with an immense sense of dread, one that made him take several steps forward and grab Jin by the arm. "Let's wait until tomorrow," he said, more a command than a suggestion. The archer's gaze followed the man and the woman as several adventurers helped to lay the man down and take off his armor, while others generously reached into their bags for healing potions. Azure was admittedly impressed by the sudden camaraderie between strangers, something incredibly rare to witness in the realm. Jin turned to him, his tone smooth but not mocking. "Are you afraid now?" "Yes," Azure admitted. "There were more than 2 of them when they went in. There are only 2 of us now." "They're a much higher level than us," the archer pointed out. "Just let's go in the morning. I'm already tired, and seeing this has only mentally drained me further." He could not tear his eyes away from the man as he screamed and winced on the floor from the provided help. "Let's away." Jin nodded toward the opposite side of the field. Several adventurers were camped on that side as well, though they were only watching from afar, not offering any aid. The archer made sure to lead Azure behind a large tent that obscured the gruesome scene from view before stopping. "We'll make camp here," he said, then knelt to start digging supplies out of his bag of holding. Though Azure could no longer see what was going on, he could still hear the adventurers around them chattering about what had happened to the unfortunate pair. "Here, let me help take your mind off it. It's time for me to teach you a new skill," Jin said gently. While Azure was grateful for his compassion, something the archer typically lacked, It was hard to concentrate with so much other excitement happening around them. Trying his best to keep Azure focused, Jin exhibited uncharacteristic patience as he instructed him one step at a time on how to tan hides, then waited for him to follow along and corrected him where it was needed. The process was long and dirty, and Azure wasn't able to give it much of his focus. All that kept going through his mind were the people he had seen die in the realm. Uden, Sir Nash Thornton, and Harlow. Though he hadn't witnessed their deaths with his own eyes, he could imagine Janine's and Franziska's deaths as well. Both horrible. And then there were his own near-death experiences. The waterfall after escaping from the lesser demon, the bats and shadowlings that had attacked him on the road to Squall's End, and then his actual death when he'd been swallowed by the chaos crackle. It seemed like there were a million different ways to die in the realm, and they were all awful. And then you dip it into the water one more time, Jin explained, then waited for Azure to follow the last of the steps. Like a ghost that barely understood what it was doing, Azure mimicked the archer and received a notification as a reward. Congratulations, new skill learned, tanning level 1. You can now process pelts into hides. This is the first step toward crafting your own light armor. You have received the following item. Rabbit hide, item class common, quality poor, weight 0.1 kilograms, uses crafting. The archer walked over to assess Azure's work, taking it from his hands and holding it to the fire's light. Not bad, he nodded, clearly just trying to placate his friend. In his distracted state, Azure had accidentally poked a few holes through the hide. He'd be lucky if it was good enough to use for scrap. Now I want you to make 10 more. Then I'll start teaching you leatherworking, Jin said, his voice full of satisfaction. There wasn't enough time for Azure to make 10 more hides that night. Of course, the archer knew that. He had just been setting Azure up with busy work to keep his mind off what he'd witnessed. Working on one hide at a time, Azure could only finish one more before exhaustion began to overtake him. One of the things that made it challenging to sleep around the never-ending dungeon was that the place never really settled. Even as Azure shut his eyes, he could hear adventurers talking with one another at their camps. Occasionally, the door to the dungeon would open and close. It was a lot of noise that kept him focused on what might be to come in the following days once they entered the dungeon. He still didn't like the idea of the two of them going in alone, but Jin seemed pretty confident that they could make it to level 20 without any casualties. And what did Azure really know? To be honest, the first 10 levels had been more mentally taxing than anything else. After struggling for about an hour, Azure was finally able to go to sleep. It would not last long, though. A short while later, he was being shaken awake. Azure groaned to life, wondering if the morning had already come. The scenery around him was dark besides the glow of campfires. 2 black leather boots blocked his view of the fire that Jin had made to keep them warm. They did not belong to the archer. Azure followed the boots up, immediately recognizing the cloak behind them. When his eyes landed on Uden's face, the first thing he noticed was a deep scowl. "You left me behind, ass!" The half-imp kicked him in the ribs. Azure curled over slightly. He'd removed his armor as soon as they made camp, hoping to find some comfort. "I'm guessing it wasn't your idea?" Uden didn't even wait for him to respond, his eyes scanning the area for the archer. "And I bet he's off hiding somewhere as usual." Azure sat up. Judging by the twinkling stars nestled in the black ocean above, it was still a few hours before morning. "I'm glad you made it." He smiled up at his friend. "Oh, are you?" The half-imp nodded with a tight expression. "Seems to me like you are just as eager to leave me behind." Azure's lips dipped into a frown. "You know I tried to get him to wait. I don't want to go into the dungeon just the two of us." "He shouldn't want that either. You're a coward sometimes," Uden stated harshly. Azure was getting tired of people telling him that, in one way or another, but perhaps it was true. "You should get some sleep before we leave. I'm guessing you battled a hangover all the way here." He laid back down, still tired. The half-imp snorted. "And let you guys leave me again? I don't think so. I'm in this for the wish, too, you know." He crossed his arms over his chest. "Now that you're here, we're not going to leave you. He just didn't want to wait for you." Azure tried to wave Uden's concern away. "We should leave him." The half-imp scoffed toward the forest. "That would show him. He needs us just as much as we need him." "My fate is linked to his," Azure pointed out. "I can't leave him." Uden raised an eyebrow at him. "Sure you can. That motherfucker is too stubborn to die. He'll be fine on his own. Heck, we could probably just go back to Finbor and wait for him to bring the keeper there. I bet he could get it done all on his own." "He probably could," Azure acknowledged. "But it wouldn't be fair. I'm not doing that to him. Just go to bed." He rested his arm over his eyes, blocking out his view of the half-imp and trying to make him go away. "Negative. I'm going to stay right here and keep you up for the rest of the night. If I can't sleep, you can't either," he said before sitting down next to Azure and leaning back against him. Then he began singing obnoxiously, his voice not keeping to any specific pitch. "It began on a hot autumn evening. I was the most sly rogue around. She was the most buxom barmaid. She was my lover, my buxom lover, my barmaid. I stole her from Azure. It was awesome. He was so scared of the dungeon. She was my lover, my buxom lover, my barmaid. He missed out. It was my gain. She said I was better. Oh, for the love of all the gods, would you shut up?" Azure glared at Udin. He turned to Azure for a fraction of a second, said, "No," and then continued with the song until the adventurers camped around them became annoyed and began shouting at him. Then he fell into silence, instead opting to poke Azure in the ribs repeatedly to keep him awake. For the first time, Azure thought that Jin had been right. They should have gone into the never-ending dungeon as soon as they had arrived and left the half-imp behind. Chapter 3. The Realm, Day 257. Not surprisingly, Udin won, successfully denying Azure the few precious hours of sleep he could have gotten. For the first time since Azure could remember, he was awake when Jin emerged from the forest. The hood of the archer's cloak was trained on the half-imp as he took long strides toward them. "I see you managed to catch up," he said to Udin, not sounding pleased. "I did." The half-imp puffed his chest out proudly. "You didn't really think I'd allow you to leave me behind, did you?" "You would have if we had entered the dungeon last night," Jin shot back, this time his discontent directed toward Azure, though it quickly faded away. "Have you guys had breakfast yet?" "We were waiting on you," Azure told him as he dug into his bag of holding for pieces of cooked deer meat to share with the group. As expected, Jin didn't want to take much time to eat. They were allowed 15 minutes before they had to pack up camp and prepare to head into the dungeon. Azure felt a deep sense of dread as they walked toward the white door. Once they entered, the archer wouldn't allow them to turn back, and they'd probably even get to a point where they couldn't. For as much as Azure had tried to forget the gruesome scene from the previous afternoon, the man's screams still echoed in his head. People had died in this dungeon just yesterday. It was a harrowing thought. Knowing better, Jin didn't even bother asking if they were ready. He simply opened the door and walked through, forcing them to follow. Udin went in next, far braver than Azure in this instance, but he hadn't been there the night before. He hadn't witnessed what Azure and Jin had witnessed, and Azure hadn't bothered to tell him about it, too focused on trying to go back to sleep despite the half-imp's best effort to keep him from it. Would Udin have walked through that door with as much confidence if he had seen a pair of adventurers mauled and grieving? There was no way to know, and perhaps that was a good thing. Being uncertain was no way to enter the never-ending dungeon. Taking a deep breath, Azure closed his eyes and stepped through the door. The gentle breeze from outside faded and was replaced by stagnant air. His boots left soft grass and set down on smooth stone. As Azure opened his eyes, he found himself in a large, dimly lit square room. Phosphorescent fungus clung to the hewn stone walls, casting an eerie blue-green glow that barely did the job to illuminate the entire area. There was a patch of wall directly across from them that had been cleared of the growth. In its place, words were chiseled in the stone, and fungus had been pushed into the indentations, creating an almost natural neon sign that said, "Condition of completion, kill all enemies." Let the slaughter begin, Azure thought morosely, thankful that there were no enemies in the room. What there was, though, were choices, 3 paths they could take. On the east wall was a wooden door. A few feet down from that was a wooden portcullis. At the far corner of the western wall was another wooden door. Azure wasn't sure where they should begin, but he was fairly certain that Jin would make that choice for them. "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo." Udin pointed to the doors and portcullis one at a time. "I wonder if we can open this." Azure strode forward to inspect the portcullis, immediately regretting it when he caught the attention of a gnome clad in armor holding a mace on the other side. The gnome raised the mace threateningly, charging towards Azure with a scowl on his face. He appeared to be a knight of sorts, his bald pate ringed with red hair, his eyebrows white and bushy. He spoke in a language that Azure didn't understand, his words ending with a harsh, almost gargled uptick. Azure held his palms up and took a step away from the portcullis. "We mean you no harm." "You know that's a lie," Udin mumbled with a roll of his eyes. As if to prove the half-imp's point, the archer knocked an arrow and prepared to fire at the gnome. Azure quickly stood in his way. "Stop! Get out of my way!" Jin snarled at him, raising his bow as if he would shoot right through Azure if he had to. "He can't get through the portcullis." Azure gestured back to it. It was true. For all the ruckus the gnome was causing, he didn't seem interested in raising the heavy wooden grating. "If we don't kill him now, more will come." The archer stepped to the side to shoot past Azure, but Azure moved right along with him to block his view. Realizing that Azure was going to continue to be stubborn, Jin redirected his attention to the half-imp. "Kill him, Udin." He nodded in the direction of the gnome. As soon as the half-imp began to move forward, Azure raised a hand to stop him. "Don't!" Udin gave a pause, a smirk playing across his face. "Are you guys about to resort to fisticuffs?" Understanding that he would get no help from the half-imp, who was gleefully waiting to see how things would play out, Jin lowered his bow. "Did you not read the writing on the wall?" "I did, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's an enemy," Azure argued. "What appears when you analyze him?" Azure hesitated to turn his head, worried that it was a trick, that Jin would shoot the gnome as soon as he was distracted. Still, he cast a quick glance over his shoulder and activated Analyze. Level 11 Austral Gnome Guard. As soon as he had gained the information, he promptly returned his attention to the archer. "He's a gnome, what of it?" "The name is generic. That means it's an enemy," Jin calmly explained. "That's not necessarily true." Azure searched his memory for past experiences. "I've encountered many an enemy in the past," he made air quotes around the word, "that was non-hostile. If we just talk to it." The archer let out a long-suffering sigh and drew a hand up to his face as if his frustration over the situation was becoming too much to bear. "I can't believe you still don't understand how dungeons work after this long." After a moment, he dropped his hand, using it to point at the gnome instead. "That," he shook his finger for emphasis, "is an enemy. It was put here for us to kill. We don't get to advance until we kill it." Realizing that they were at a stalemate, Azure turned his attention to Udin. "Can you understand what language he's speaking?" He glanced back at the gnome, though he dared not tear his gaze away from Jin for too long. "Nope," the half-imp replied simply, a bemused look still stretched across his face. Now it was Azure who sighed, wishing he would have taken the time to learn Gnomish. All the gnomes he'd encountered so far in the realm spoke common tongue, though. "Do you understand him?" he asked Jin. "He says we can't be here," the archer informed him. "It sounds like he's saying a lot more than that," the half-imp noted of the gnome's unwavering, one-sided conversation. "Is he saying why we can't be here?" Azure pressed. "Because we're trespassing." Jin shifted his weight. "If we do not leave, he will inform the others." "Tell him we're just here to kill monsters." Azure nodded toward the gnome for the archer to relay the message. Jin was still for a moment, then he walked past Azure with purpose. Trusting that the archer would do the right thing, Azure made no attempt to intervene, though he felt tension in his shoulders as Jin passed. That tension doubled when he watched the archer raise his bow. Azure moved to stop him, but Jin was too quick. With nearly imperceptible speed, he planted an arrow between the gnome's eyes, replacing its incessant rambling with a grunt, followed by a clanking sound as the gnome fell forward, clutching onto the portcullis until the weight of its death dragged it to the ground. "Bravo!" Udin nodded and golf-clapped in the archer's direction. Azure's mouth fell open, though part of him didn't know why he was so surprised. Ignoring his reaction, Jin went to retrieve his arrow from the dead gnome's skull. "Well, that took care of that. And hey, looky there, I leveled up." "Congratulations." The half-imp bowed his head to the archer. As soon as the shock had left Azure, his body stiffened. They were clearly at an impasse, neither willing to bend on their stance concerning killing. Azure would not suffer 10 more levels of this, would not wander deeper into the dungeon knowing he'd likely be forced to do things he'd later regret. It was not worth all the gold in the world to him. "I'm leaving," he said plainly. The archer turned to him, the blood-soaked arrow still clutched in his hand. For a moment he didn't speak, and they simply stared at one another. Finally he was able to form words, but it was nothing that Azure hadn't heard at least a dozen times before. There is no other way to do this, Azure. You say that, but we haven't even tried finding another way. If you really believe that, then stay here. I'm going back to Nozion. Well, I am staying here, Jin would.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?